Mr. Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen, as we all know, we're living through hard times, and there is tragedy and pain for everyone in this region, both Israelis and Palestinians. But we have the chance tonight to lift our eyes, to seek inspiration for going forward and how to go forward in the words and deeds of Nelson Mandela. I knew him for more than 55 years. I reported him when he was a lawyer in Johannesburg and a leader in the African National Congress. I reported him when he was working underground to overthrow apartheid. I visited him in prison as a friend. I met him after he was released, when he was president, and when he retired. And among the host of memories of that whole span of years, there is a particular story that stands out, and I've written about it, but I'd like to tell you about it again. It goes back a long way to 1961. The year before, there'd been the Sharpeville massacre after a past protest launched by the Pan-Africanist Congress. And as a result of that, Mandela called for a 3-day stay-at-home. It was called a stay-at-home because strikes by blacks were illegal. But the police were hunting him, and he spent months underground. You might remember it was called the Black Pimpernel. Well, during that time, he and I were meeting secretly. We had a method of exchanging messages, and we'd either meet at a house in the suburbs, or I'd drive my car to a dark corner, a dark street in Johannesburg, and we'd meet there and talk for an hour or so. And this tall, burly, imposing man, and the whole police force, as I say, was hunting, his disguise was a worker's boiler suit. But he got away with it. But the day came that the 3-day strike started. I, by that stage, had become so expert at reporting the townships and riots that I was kept back in the office to collate all the reports coming through from throughout the country. And I sat there through the night working. We were going to bring out an 8 a.m. special edition. And in the way that it happens in a newspaper, or can happen, it's not a conspiracy, it's called a cock-up. The sub-editors grabbed the story when the government issued a statement and said to the Johannesburg municipality to say the strike had failed. Well, it hadn't. It wasn't quite as great as Mandela had hoped for, but it was not the failure that the government said it was. It was about 50-50. But the Rand Mail came out of the special edition at 8 o'clock, headlines, strike failed. And the Mail at that stage was highly respected in the black community, and hundreds of thousands of people had stayed home to see what was going to happen, because they were scared. They were scared of the police, they were scared of being fired by their bosses, they were scared of the Tsotsis, the gangsters at the end of the day, and they were waiting to see what happened. When the Mail came out and said the strike had failed, people said, that's it, and hundreds of thousands poured out to work. So I sat at my desk feeling crushed, terrible, depressed, what my newspaper had done to Mandela after those months of dangerous work underground. And in mid-morning my phone rang, and I picked it up, and there was this warm, cheery voice, the same as always. And I started just muttering an apology. Didn't know what to say. And he broke through, he cut me off, and he said, "It's okay, Ben, to call me. I know it wasn't your fault." It was an act of the most incredible generosity, just to exculpate me from any blame for what we had done to him, because we destroyed that strike of his. And it's a story I've never forgotten, and it's an experience, to me, which personifies the man. More than anything else, that generosity of spirit was Nelson Mandela. And it was his strength. It was his attitude towards others which underpinned his leadership. And his leadership was critical, as we know, in resolving the fight to the death between whites and blacks in South Africa. After 27 years of imprisonment, he emerged into South Africa torn by violence as the black majority struggled for freedom against the ruling white minority. He did not beat the drum of racism, as he could easily have done, He did not incite his people with calls for revenge for what they had suffered. Instead, he quelled the anger among his own people and led them on the path of compromise and reconciliation. And it wasn't easy. He had to persuade them. And his courage and vision earned the respect and support of most whites, which allowed for the rise of a new united South Africa of democracy and non-racism. A connected lesson is that he did not act alone. He could not have achieved what he did without the cooperation of whites who commanded the firepower. And his leadership was therefore equally crucial. The last apartheid president, F.W. de Klerk, began on the right wing of his right-wing Afrikaner National Party. His exact role in the last violent years of apartheid remains uncertain. But at the time, he came to recognize that white rule could no longer be sustained, and in facing up to reality, also overcame opposition among his own people, and with equal courage, he urged and persuaded them to pursue a new road. There was, too, another Afrikaner, whose role is little remembered these days, General Constant Viljoen, the former head of the South African Defence Force. He brought together white right-wing groups in the Afrikaner Volksfront, the Afrikaner People's Front. And as the country headed for its first democratic elections with a black government assured, he was said to have 50 to 60,000 army-trained white men ready to fight to preserve Afrikaner interests. As the election in April 94 approached, South Africa, as you'll remember, was on a knife edge. It was in grave danger of sliding into a racial civil war. But only weeks before the elections, Viljoen changed direction, backed away from violence, and opted for the ballot box, taking his people with him. The lessons for Israelis and Palestinians could not be clearer. Leaders who are entering a no-win situation with immense suffering for all involved must acknowledge the situation and for the greater good of their country and people put their political existence on the line by persuading their followers to think radically anew. There is much else to be learnt from Mandela's leadership. If you look at your invitation to this event, at his words, in every dispute you eventually reach a point when neither party is altogether right or altogether wrong, when compromise is the only alternative for those who eventually want peace and stability. Those are words of wisdom, yet sacred, for the Ambassador Common Sense. He realized the importance of symbols, and as we saw in that film clip earlier, he donned the Springbok jersey in 1995 as an act of reconciliation, and that won him the hearts of countless numbers of whites, and especially Afrikaners. His humanity and compassion was shown not only in grand gestures, but in the way he reached out to ordinary people, little people. Among the many, many anecdotes is the one about the first rugby game between South Africa and England after the end of apartheid. And walking onto the field to greet the players, Mandela said to the chairman of the English Rugby Union who was with him, "I hope I'm going to meet the important people." And the chairman said, "Yes, of course, you're going to meet the players." And Mandela said, "No, the important people, the ball boys." Well, his sense of humour, time and again, lightened the most serious of occasions. It was part of his gift for turning enemies into admirers, and highlighted that at the essence of his being was respect for the other and willingness to talk and to listen. However, care is needed in seeking lessons from him. Understandably, whether Palestinians or Israelis, leftists or rightists, people take from Mandela only the words or lessons they perceive best illustrate their beliefs or struggle. And unfortunately, only too often, their choices are based on incorrect knowledge about Mandela and the nature of the struggle for freedom in South Africa. Violence much misinterpreted issue. After decades of unsuccessfully pleading with whites to end discrimination, and after the repeated failure of non-violent protests, Mandela and his colleagues took the fateful decision in 1961 to turn to armed resistance. Some hold this up as justifying Palestinian violence against Israeli civilians. However, it was a focused resistance, with attacks targeting property and the military. The policy avoided attacks on civilians, firstly because the African National Congress and its supporters were imbued with Mahatma Gandhi's belief in non-violent protest, and secondly, based on the fact that whites feared being murdered and swept into the sea by the black majority. Thus, indiscriminate killings would have reinforced the fear and stiffened white opposition to yielding power to blacks. During the next 3 decades, the ANC's armed wing, Umkhonto Sizwe, Spirit of the Nation, adhered to this policy with only a few exceptions. And it proved an effective strategy when circumstances changed, because then fear was not a major factor in determining the white attitude towards the transitions to come. Mandela supported Palestinian liberation. Of course he did, he had to. But an important statement he made about it is consistently misused. He is often quoted as saying, quote, "But we know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians," unquote. And he did indeed use those words in December 1997 on Palestinian Solidarity Day. However, he went on to say, and the additional words are this, "without the resolution of conflicts in East Timor, the Sudan, and other parts of the world," unquote. Thus, he spoke about Palestinian liberation in the context of freedom for all people. The omission of the second half of the sentence, whether done out of ignorance or for propaganda purposes, changes the meaning of the universal message in which he believed. He was always straightforward about Israel. He totally opposed the occupation, but he did not question Israel's existence or its right to security. That is important to understand in view of ugly things said about him from the right wing of the Jewish political spectrum. He came under fierce attack for supporting not only Yasser Arafat, but dictators like Castro and Gaddafi. His detractors never understood that during the years of struggle against apartheid, these were the people who aided the ANC while Israel stood back. ANC fighters trained with Palestinians while Cuba and Libya supplied arms and training. When freedom came, it would have been out of character for Mandela to discard those who had stood with him for so long. Nor, as some extremist Jews claim, was he, the phrase is, anti-Semitic to the core, unquote, and deserving of the abuse they were heaping on him in internet comments such as, quote, "a treacherous lying fraud," unquote. His entire life refutes this viciousness, both in terms of his humanity and in the many Jews who were close to him, and as the ambassador referred to it, and supported him, from his personal friends and political comrades through to his lawyers. South Africa and the world, as we all know, were enriched beyond measure by Nelson Mandela. We in Israel and Palestine can benefit not only by honouring him, but by seeking to apply his thinking and his actions to resolving our own tortured conflict. Thank you.